what motivated me to throw this to you, because I'm so interested to hear your take on it. I'm happy he didn't get the death penalty because I don't believe in the death penalty. On the other hand, I see the parents in the back of the courtroom in their anguish and anger, some of them, and I'm sure they're really rightly upset about it. But then my brain goes to, well, what are we trying to do here? What is the purpose of punishment, of sentencing, and in this case, the death penalty? From the very moment a defendant is involved in this system, someone else has control over their story. They want to define that person solely by the crime they may have committed. You have a sentencing date set, and the stakes are high. Both lawyer and client need to do everything in their power to prepare. But the question is, are you ready? I'm Doug Berman. I'm a 25-year defense lawyer, a sentencing consultant, and an award-winning documentary filmmaker. In Set for Sentencing, I'm going across disciplines and outside the box to help both lawyer and client expand their perspective, build on their skills, and get real results in the form of significantly reduced sentences. All of this in service to one goal: to bring more fairness, more compassion, and more justice to the sentencing process. So, are you ready? Then let's get set for sentencing. Hey everybody, this is Doug Berman coming to you from Studio 3553 in Scottsdale, Arizona. Helping us get set for sentencing today, Professor Douglas A. Berman. Doug to his friends. Professor Berman, as you may know, is a professor of law at the Moritz College of Law at The Ohio State University. His real area of focus is sentencing, particularly federal sentencing. His sentencing law and policy blog receives nearly 100,000 page views per month, and maybe for me is the be-all, end-all primary source of all the great new information, law review articles, policy issues, really just amazing stuff. It's every day in my inbox. There's something in there, and it's usually motivating an episode of the podcast. So thank you. How you doing? Welcome back.
I'm great. Thank you for that nice promotion of the blog. I really enjoy putting lots of different things on the blog and knowing that there's lots of great people who are interested in the kind of content that comes across my desk and that I want to share.
It's important stuff. So I wanted you back today to talk really about two significant current events. Now, we had a conversation. It was episode 6 called The Devil You Know, and we really peeled back the layers on the sentencing guidelines. So if people are interested in that, check it out. That was a long form conversation. This may be a little more short form, but there were two big events. One of them today, actually, the day we're filming this, which is Thursday, October 13th. But let's talk about the events of the last week, which is President Biden's federal marijuana simple possession pot pardons. Most people, well, hopefully people have heard about it, but tell me what it is and who it implicates.
Sure, absolutely. So President Biden, really a surprise to many people. I'd heard maybe some talk, and there's been lots of advocacy from a variety of folks in the criminal justice space, in the cannabis policy space, urging President Biden to sort of follow up on his talk about favoring maybe marijuana decriminalization or some kind of marijuana reform that we heard from him on the campaign trail some years ago. And he hadn't done really much and hadn't even spoken to it much in these first 2 years in office. But last week, as you mentioned, he issued a blanket pardon to all federal marijuana possession offenders, although there are some carve-outs and exceptions that are sort of for the technical folks out there, of which I know there are plenty. There's some concern and care about. Technically doesn't cover military offenses, and it also doesn't cover non-citizen offenders. And that second one's particularly a big ticket item because for many years, sometimes still today, marijuana possession offenses have become part of border enforcement. And so there's been some criticism already that was one of the carve-outs. But most fundamentally, what's included is everybody currently with a misdemeanor federal marijuana possession offense now has a pardon. And the Sentencing Commission did a numbers run to see that there were, since 1992, and the pardon goes back earlier than that, but the commission, I think, just has data from the last 30 years. There's somewhere in the neighborhood of 7,000 offenders that have gotten pardoned as a result of this. And then there's also a DC population that's a different number count there. And so, it's a lot of people. Now, relative to the big bad federal criminal justice system, it may not seem like much. And that's one of the concerns, is it doesn't extend to any traffickers, doesn't extend to anybody involved in any other kinds of offenses. But, I'm inclined to say something is better than nothing. And this is a pretty big something. And I'll do the last piece of this that is wonky in another way. Mass pardons actually has quite a rich American history. We're into these days for constitutional interpretation purposes, looking back at the framers and the founders and, what's history and tradition as we come to understand our Constitution. Well, history and tradition was, for many of the early first generation presidents, mass pardons for all sorts of different causes and all sorts of different settings. And yet in modern times, we haven't seen a mass pardon since the Vietnam War era pardoning done by Ford and Carter. And so just to do a mass pardon itself, especially in our kind of modern era of mass incarceration and a sort of tough on crime hangover, you might say, that we still have, is worth, again, celebrating. So the last piece I'll emphasize, and apologies for a long-winded first accounting, there's an estimate, or the assessment is there's nobody who's currently incarcerated in federal prison for a marijuana possession offense who gets any kind of relief from this. There are plenty of persons, probably thousands, still incarcerated for marijuana offenses in the federal system, but those are all major trafficking offenses, because that's who gets, longer periods of time. The vast majority of folks who are prosecuted and sentenced for possession offenses, they're getting probation, they're getting maybe a few months in jail, maybe they get time served if they've already served some time as their case is being processed. So another layer of sort of concern and complaint here is, by limiting it to possession offenses, you're not doing anything about the federal prison populations for the time being.
Right. Okay, that was a lot of great information in there. And the only one I didn't know about military, and I didn't know about non-citizen offenders. The non-citizen offenders doesn't surprise me, because when a person is either trying to become a citizen or get lawful status, if they have criminal convictions on their record, they probably can't. And so that really does bum me out, because it's the least serious kind of conviction you could ever have on your record. It's something that's legal in many, many states, including my state, which is a border state. It's legal. It's legal.
Yeah.
So that's a little ticky tacky for my taste. The other thing is that, I've been in federal practice for, 20 some years, and I only have one simple marijuana case that I can think of. And we just don't see that often. So right. In a sense, this seems almost ceremonious. And
rightly so, right? And that's the broader story. And actually important to highlight that among the things that President Biden said in making his announcement of these pardons is that he was encouraging state governors to follow his lead, and that it's kind of the right follow-up, because the vast majority of low-level marijuana offenses are at the state and local level. And so if you really wanted to have a huge impact in lots of people's lives, we would need state governors to follow up. That said, 6,000 plus people is nothing to sneeze at. And there's lots of evidence, and this was actually mentioned in the pardon statement, whether it's educational benefits, whether it's housing benefits, employment, that conviction can still sting for those individuals. And, there are lots of cases, some of the data and information about who gets these convictions, they often are the lowest of low-hanging stuff, really, wrong place, wrong time. Lots of these are in national parks, where maybe you're even in a national park where it's legal in that state, but technically you're on federal property. Sometimes this happens on military bases, right? So, someone has perhaps even legal medical marijuana in their car, and they're driving on a military base, and their car is being searched as part of that, and that's found. And then that gets them in trouble. And so, you're right, not quite ceremonial, but these are the lowest of low convictions. And yet at the same time, particularly because, and I blogged about this the other day, there's no other mechanism in federal law to get these kinds of convictions sealed or expunged or otherwise subject to some kind of record relief. Pardons is the only way to go. As much as you say, hey, these are sort of small fry stuff. It's like, yes, but all the more reason that giving them some relief, is long overdue. And again, I think a valuable first step by the president towards changing federal marijuana policy.
Well, I love your optimism and your hopeful tone. I sometimes am a little more of a cynic, but it makes me think of the Beatles and apparently why John and Paul were such a good songwriting team is because Paul was the optimistic one and John was the very dark, sad one. So maybe we're the Beatles of sentencing.
I like imagining that, and you can turn me dark in a heartbeat if you really try to. So it's
getting better all the time. Can't get much worse.
And I would say that in many respects, it's not just, is this the first step of future steps? That's a reason to be optimistic. And of course, we can talk about, he also recommended a review of marijuana scheduling under federal law, and that's a necessary next step to be keeping an eye on. But then it's also, how does the politics and the broader conversation about marijuana policy play afterwards? And I think this was not just notable, as an October surprise, right? We're a month before a midterm election, though obviously not an election that President Biden is himself directly up on. But we've seen precious little pushback that suggests that the instinct that I think the White House must have had, that this is a political winner, and one that will garner attention. We're doing this podcast, lots of other people have mentioned, and do so in a positive way. Again, that gives a reason for a certain kind of optimism, but you know what? We're already, a couple decades into marijuana reform, and federal law hasn't yet budged. And so I think it's slow in coming. This is progress, but again, there's a basis to be pessimistic that we're going to see a lot more progress on.
That was going to be my next question, because this is a nice first step, if you will. But what do you think the odds are that, the ultimate goal is either decriminalization or just legalization in federal? Do you think that's
I actually this is a little bit of a something to keep an eye on for the coming election. There are 5 states that are voting on full legalization this midterm 2022, but for Maryland, where everybody assumes a relatively blue state, it's going to pass with a pretty significant margin. The 4 others are red states, and pretty deep red states: Arkansas, Missouri, North Dakota, and South Dakota. And if we were to see, and again, whether Biden's move here might, influence this at all, if we were to see in all 4 of those red states, not just the legalization initiative passing, but passing, very comfortably, 55-45, maybe even 60-40, I think that could be not quite a dam breaker, but make it even easier for what I think is probably true for an awful lot of red state officials, which is, I'm okay with federal law getting out of the way, at least allowing this to be a kind of a states' rights issue. But I don't want to be the one kind of, leading with my chin on that, right? And there are certainly plenty of social conservatives and others who remain concerned about, kind of federal legalization being seen as a endorsement, not just of marijuana use, but of, kind of a quote unquote retreat from fighting the drug war. And so I do think if all those red states were to come online, it's very clear politically that there's, dramatic support in red states for full legalization. I think some of the bills that would at least leave it to the states to make their own choices on marijuana reform would have a shot in the next Congress, even if that Congress is controlled by Republicans. Although the last thing I'll say, and you never know what to predict in this crazy time with Congress, but I've heard that Senator McConnell is particularly grumpy about marijuana reform, and didn't like that the hemp bill that he helped engineer in 2018 has kind of accelerated a variety of marijuana reforms at the state level and elsewhere. And so if the Senate flips to Republican control and he's in charge, it may be that he'll stop anything from getting through under his watch. Whereas if you imagine a world, which seems to be kind of the betting line, that the Republicans are in control on the House side, but the Democrats retain control on the Senate side. That might be the exact combination that gets something modest done in the next Congress that gets us to a certain kind of decriminalization. But again, there's a lot of miles to go to get there.
Nice. All right, two little points that you mentioned on the opening explanation. Just for people who aren't totally familiar with the nuance, DC is interesting to me because DC is not a state, obviously. So that means that basically all of the things that we usually prosecute in the state level offenses are all federally prosecuted in DC. So that means that there's probably a ton of simple marijuana possession that are equivalent, akin to a state prosecution that are happening federally in DC. Do you have any idea what the numbers are going to be?
I don't, and that's exactly right. That was sort of my first reaction when they sort of put out this general number, and we think it's this many folks federally. I'm like, okay, does that include DC? And then they're like, no, DC is a different number. We can't figure that one out, and so we'll see what that looks like. I think it could be a huge number. Although keep in mind that DC fully legalized marijuana, and as of, I believe, 2014, if I'm not mistaken. And so they weren't arresting people under sort of DC local law. And then it became sort of the similar story of, okay, if you're on federal property in DC, now, again, technically it's all federal property, but I'm meaning, if you're on the mall, you're in a place where federal officials are in charge, there's more enforcement. Here again, I would defer. It's almost worth getting somebody on who's a DC criminal defense expert, because the way in which all those different players sort of add up to enforcement for marijuana or a bunch of other issues is always really complicated.
Okay. Two more questions, then we're going to move on to today's topic. But you said in your blog, which is what motivated me to do this podcast episode, it was so intriguing. I'm going to quote you: lots of formal and informal ripples for criminal justice systems and sentencing. The legal, policy, political, and practical consequences of these moves are going to be fascinating and a bit unpredictable, I suspect. I know we've talked about some of these, but I just want to make sure what else is on your mind in terms of the ripples? What do you think these ripples?
Sure. Well, and I'll go a bunch of different directions. One, we'll start at the state level, right? We mentioned before, the recommendation to governors to do their own pardoning in this space. My sense is not a lot of them are going to take up Biden's call, partially because the ones who might have been inclined to do so have already done so. We've seen this in Illinois. We've seen some of it being done in Pennsylvania. There was
in my state.
Yeah. And so there was in North Carolina, the governor there has talked about it. And so there may be a layer of ripple, but then particularly, I think, significant is the divide between kind of low-level possession offenses and more serious offenses at the state level is much more complicated than it is at the federal level. Again, as we were sort of talking about before, the vast majority of prosecutions at the federal level are going to be for sort of very high-level trafficking, or they leave it to the states. And so if states sort of start proceeding down the path of some form of pardoning, that potentially gets them involved in pardoning a lot more types of offenses if they're sort of thinking about this in kind of a robust way. And we've seen this play out in states when they fully legalize and their reform includes some retroactive resentencing. I remember seeing like 100-page journal that was produced in California to just try to figure out how do you unwind a bunch of old sentences, especially when, and this is the part that I think is one of the echoes I was thinking about, when a lot of those offenses aren't what a person's currently serving time for, but was part of the criminal history that formally drove up their sentences, whether it was under some kind of three strikes law, whether it was under just, criminal history being calculated. Again, federal and state systems are different, but all care about past offenses. And we've seen in a variety of settings, efforts to either expunge or vacate or change past criminal history before somebody's getting sentenced for something new, and how the court should deal with that, whether this pardon process, whether what Biden's already done or what states may be doing, gives somebody who's currently serving time under a three strikes law or something else to sort of go in and say, I merit resentencing because I had a prior criminal history that got me a longer sentence, but that's now gone away. And the president said that's gone away. Another thing that I was thinking about, I would suspect a number of these folks have already had compassionate release motions already written up, but is this another argument for persons serving for trafficking offenses to get compassionate release? That's very discretionary. That's very open to all sorts of considerations by all sorts of different judges. I was actually involved in a case here locally where I wrote a letter in support of a person who received life without parole for a major marijuana trafficking offense, but there was no violence involved. There was nothing else connected to it. The judge seemed sympathetic to possible resentencing, but the individual had only served a small portion, about 10 years of a life sentence. I'm not sure exactly how you proportion life sentences, but the judge seemed inclined to say, boy, if we get to 20 years and nothing else has happened, I might be more open to find the standards for compassionate relief satisfied. Could you say, will somebody try to say, the very fact that Biden granted a blanket pardon for low-level offenders amounts to a kind of extraordinary and compelling circumstance that justifies a possible resentencing of a marijuana offense? And I think that's a hard sell, but I just mentioned earlier that we haven't had a blanket pardon in 50 years, right? So the sort of idea that it's compelling and extraordinary that the president of the United States has said that people shouldn't go to prison for using this substance. Well, why should I be serving such a long term for helping people use this substance? That's the nature of the argument. Again, I'm not sure it'll convince many people, but maybe it becomes an extra bit of weightiness for an otherwise, extreme sentence, which we know are common for a bunch of other reasons in our system.
I'm thinking about, so nobody right now is serving time federally for simple possession, but I guarantee you there's a big group of people who are serving time who had a simple possession marijuana felony on their record that was used to enhance their criminal history category under the guidelines.
Yep.
And that could be interesting. That could be an interesting, because if you could show that those whatever 1 or 2 or 3 points would have resulted in a reduction. Now, the guidelines, I learned this from our friend Mark Allenbaugh when we were doing the Steve Bannon podcast, which is the guidelines allow judges to consider pardon conduct, but that's different than actually assigning criminal history points and bumping up your category. So
absolutely, and that's also where you've got your finger on. Generally, this will all hash out at, every pun intended there, judicial discretion, right? That to me, the biggest story after the First Step Act is how much more discretion judges have to do essentially resentencing through compassionate release. And, we even saw the one sentencing case from the Supreme Court last term, this Concepcion case, that basically emphasized the point that if the Constitution and or Congress has not said you can't consider that judge, well, then judges can consider just about anything in the course of sort of sorting through the 3553A factors. And so, again, I'm certain people will put it forward as an argument, and I'm certain that a judge can be empowered to give it some weight. It's a question of, so much weight that it makes a difference in how they might otherwise look at a case.
Okay. Last question. This certificate of a pardoner, do you know how a person could even go about getting that?
Yeah, so my understanding is they're going to set up an administrative process for that. And I assume the point is to give them a piece of paper that actually allows an individual who has one of these convictions that's been pardoned to prove that. Because, you know enough. It's one thing to say, this is the law. It's another thing to actually have people believe it, right? And to apply for a job, to apply for housing. Yeah. And you show up on a background check, you otherwise, have triggered some search. Often it's third-party searches that keep track of these records, and to have an official piece of paper that showcases, no, I've been pardoned by the president. It also, I think it's probably kind of cool, right? I mean, I hope for folks who have struggled with the burden of a conviction, getting an official piece of paper, presumably with at least a machine manufactured version of the president's signature, saying you've been pardoned of this offense, is
Yeah,
not
nice.
insignificant, right?
A little keepsake, a little collectible.
Exactly.
It almost makes me wish I had a federal marijuana conviction on my record.
You can always try to get one now and hope that he'll do this again in a few years.
Well, it's interesting is it's the lights that go off when I hear you speak, but this also implicates the whole ban the box discussion, because if I apply for a job, the application is going to say, have you ever been convicted of a felony? And even if I'm pardoned, technically, haven't I? And then I have to go, well, yeah, but here's my certificate. The other thing is when the police officer pulls you over and he runs your criminal history, no pardon's going to be showing up in the, he was convicted for marijuana, but pardon, so it's still lingering out there the way our system makes it.
Absolutely. And this has been a big issue, not just related to pardons and how that gets treated in the federal system, but even official record sealing and expungements at the state level. There's so much uncertainty, partially because the law is uncertain, partially because, I'll give you an example from Ohio. We technically have record sealing as our broadest remedy, but then a couple crimes, it can be expunged. And almost everybody uses those terms interchangeably, even though legally they're completely separate and different and have different consequences and different echoes to it. And so it's just challenging to even keep up with the nomenclature, let alone, like you mentioned, well, do I have an obligation to say I had this passed if it's been sealed and I'm told, no, the whole point of it being sealed is I don't have to tell people about this and it no longer exists in one form or another. And rightly so, and I mentioned this earlier, lots of times it's private third parties that are keeping track of these records and these big databases that employers are paying into and the like, and they often don't update their records based on expungements, record sealing, and often the law needs to order them to do so. It's one thing to order them to do so, it's another thing for them to actually do it. And so this is the long tail of criminal records that, again, it's, I think, a great service to the conversation for President Biden to not only issue these pardons, but talk about how having even the lowest level conviction can impact employment, housing, a range of other life course realities in ways that I think we largely forget about if somebody's not incarcerated, and yet there's so much more that.
Yeah. And a whole other podcast, which I've had, but we could have a whole other conversation about the racial implications of the way that we target people for enforcement on something like marijuana possession. So the point is, even, I guess the takeaway is, even with a pardon, these things are stains on your record that are pretty hard to scrub off.
Yeah, I think that's
a lot of damage done for a really fucking stupid crime. But anyway, okay. I'm glad I got the last word in on that one. So just real quick, because today was an interesting day. I was surprised. I was watching the verdict come down in the Nikolas Cruz case, which, as I'm sure everybody knows, is the Parkland massacre. And I have some thoughts on it. I guess I'll just tell you what motivated me to throw this to you, because I'm so interested to hear your take on it. I'm happy he didn't get the death penalty because I don't believe in the death penalty. On the other hand, I see the parents in the back of the courtroom in their anguish and anger, some of them, and I'm sure they're really rightly upset about it. But then my brain goes to, well, what are we trying to do here? What is the purpose of punishment, of sentencing, and in this case, the death penalty? Because if the stated purpose, I guess, maybe is deterrence, we have to have this ultimate penalty, but realistically, for a kid like Nicholas Cruz and the many others who have come before, and unfortunately many others that'll come after, then there's no rational calculation going on in their mind that, well, I probably ought not to do this because I could get in really serious trouble or maybe even get the death penalty. And what else is left besides just pure vengeance? Like, we want you to die because you did this horrible, terrible thing. And I don't know if vengeance is supposed to be a part of our criminal justice system. I don't see vengeance listed in the 3553 factors. So I don't know what's going on here. And I want your take.
Sure. Well, it's a great question of what's the purpose, right? And, I think, I know I teach my students that, Immanuel Kant famously said, if we were to disband a society, we'd still have a moral obligation to execute all the murderers, because he had this retributivist vision of that's just punishment, right? So what you're inclined to call vengeance, other people would say is justice, right? At least to the extent that there's a vision of justice that says the very, very worst crime needs to be met with our very, very worst punishment, which we generally, consider to be death, although, historically it included torture and all sorts of other horrible things as well. And so I always emphasize in my sentencing class, like, death's the ultimate sanction only if we've taken other ones off the table, right? We've taken torture off the table. We've taken death to an entire family off the table, if we're just looking at the offender, him or herself. And so to me, what was so fascinating about watching the Cruz trial unfold is, my sense was, it was the most poignant and, sad example of the very worst of all possible crimes, right? Just looking at the number of people dead, who they were, where the crime was committed. And I believe, this was the worst mass shooting to ever go to trial, because with larger body counts, the perpetrator killed themselves or were killed by police. And so, in some kind of sad quantitative way, this was absolutely the very worst crime that was ever became a capital trial. On the flip side, though, you couldn't get a more robust mitigating conversation around the offender, right? That, it was a first offender. We often talk about that, and we don't often think about that in these extreme cases, but that still is part of the story. And, it just barely became a legal adult. And what I saw about his upbringing and his history and fetal alcohol syndrome and a range of other developmental disorders, the case in mitigation was as robust and profound. Now, capital litigators know that's common in a lot of the most awful capital cases. But again, this extreme almost dichotomy between the worst of the worst offense and yet the most mitigated story that was able to be told about the offender. And then here's where I think we may have talked about this a little bit last time. It's something that these capital cases always drive me toward is, and there was great virtue in having the community, as represented by the jury, kind of make the call about how to sort all that out, rather than relying on a judge who, no matter how good or bad any individual judge is, maybe thinking about their professional future, maybe thinking about, the next case and the case after that, and has a certain kind of embedded commitment to the system that may itself be influencing how he or she is asking that good question of, well, what's the purpose here? Whereas the jurors could come at it as one-timers. And in some respects, I hope they remain kind of anonymous one-timers who hear all the evidence, have it all hopefully presented well to them. That's why defense counsel and good prosecution is so important, so they can be well-informed and fully informed. And then they'll do as good a job, probably a better job than you or I could do, in giving you their instincts, and maybe just instincts, about the purpose, right? And this time they decided not to impose the death sentence. And that's, I'll be the first to say, I don't know what I would do in that situation, because I didn't listen to all the evidence, and this just seems like such a hard case. But I also will be the first to say, I trust that judgment, because that certainly seemed within the realm of reason. And as you put it eloquently to start, like, it's unclear what purpose can be served here with either verdict, right? I mean, that's the part that's so distressing, is it's just so hard to even understand how to make sense of, one of the most awful crimes in American history, and then to figure out how to, sort of rationally deal with the offender is kind of almost defies easy explanation. Yeah. I feel comforted that members of the community were part of helping us figure that out.
I kind of hope that the jury does speak, or we get a little insight. It just, the only way I can interpret it is they really did judge the person as much as they judge the crime, which is exactly the way I believe our system should work. The idea, though, of you going back to Kant and retribution and this sort of thing, like, isn't life in prison? I mean, especially for this kid who every day is going to be a living nightmare. Maybe even a fate worse than death. The other thing is if this were a death penalty case, it wouldn't be over for a very long time. And these poor moms and dads would have to keep going back and appeal. And, you're talking another 10, 15 years. So to me, it would have made more sense. He pled guilty, life without parole, and try to put that part and move. I don't know.
No, well, it's interesting you say that. And again, here's where I'm inclined to assume, and I haven't spoken to the prosecutors or heard them talk about their decision to reject a plea option and move forward with this trial. But I think they could defend what they're doing and saying, look, it's for the community to decide, right? I don't necessarily want that to be my choice.
Yeah.
Obviously, there were plenty of family members who were saying, we want the death penalty, right? So I could particularly imagine and would be most supportive if all of the victims' representatives were, we don't want to go through the agony of a trial. We don't want, we recognize, and I hope a prosecutor would explain to them, look, if he gets the death penalty, we're going to have appeal after appeal after appeal, and it's going to be in the news again. And the possibility, even if we get a death sentence, we'll have to redo it. And, whether it was the Boston Marathon bomber or, I just saw this week, the Supreme Court refused cert review on Dylan Roof, the Charleston mass shooter, but that just means he's going to go to 2255 and get to be in the news some more. And so I can certainly see how victims' families could make the rational choice, let's just get this done with life without parole. But if, as was the case here, it seemed like the community was pretty divided, and some were advocating for a death sentence and others were against it, to again, leave it to the jury and let them make their call. Hopefully there'll be respect for that now. And that's the other part is I hope the family at least, feels, those who wanted the death penalty feels at least like they were heard, even if ultimately, what they wanted wasn't what was achieved through the process.
I would be curious to hear from some of the parents. I mean, I know we're going to hear from a lot of them because sentencing is not technically concluded because they get a chance to be heard. But I'll be interested to know if any of the parents who wanted the death penalty at the outset, but then sat through all the mitigation, have a different perspective now or not. You mentioned this idea about Dylan Roof and having him in the spotlight. I think that's another big consideration because we tend to want to not even say the name of someone who commits such an atrocious act because we don't want to give them recognition. But inevitably, if you go to trial, you force them to trial and you force them to go through a death penalty trial, you're giving them a spotlight, like it or not. But here's my real fear, Professor. I think I'm old enough to remember when Ronald Reagan was shot and John Hinckley went to trial and pled insanity and was successful. And instead of going to prison where everybody was clamoring for him to go to prison for the rest of his life, he went to a mental facility. And the public was so outraged that they gutted the insanity defense. And I really worry about, in this case, the whole world, the eyes of the whole country, the whole world were on this terrible, ugly, horrific massacre. And people were screaming for the death penalty. And nobody is paying attention to the mitigation. Nobody's going to do the nuances and the shades of gray and the goals of punishment like you and I are doing. They just wanted vengeance and they didn't get it. And they're going to look at it as a failure of the system. And some politician is going to start passing legislation that makes death penalty easier, as if it's not already easy to do. Is that me just being paranoid? Please say yes. Hopeful. Be my Paul McCartney.
I will. I will be hopeful here. And we talked about this a little bit last time. I think what's really remarkable, we're 3 years into an uptick in murders. Certainly there's an incredible amount of crime talk, and we've seen in this midterm cycle a number of GOP candidates pushing crime conversations, hoping that they can score political points and get the backing of more voters because they are saying they're going to be tougher on a range of crimes. I've heard precious little conversation about we need to make it easier to get the death penalty. We need more people to get executed. We need to kind of ramp up in the way that we heard back in the 80s and the 90s, the kind of last time when there was this uptick in crime and an uptick in crime that produced kind of really what the modern death penalty looks like. And so I think our appetite for death penalty has waned dramatically, and could a return of a life sentence in this very high profile case again sort of rev people up? I certainly think there's a chance, and in fact I'm all but certain there will be bills proposed, right? Mandatory death penalty if there's more than a certain number of deaths, or limits on mitigation, whatever the possibility is, I certainly could cater to your concerns by saying there will be proposals. But I just get the sense that there's not that same kind of what always was false hope, which is, oh, if we kill a few more people through state punishment, we'll have a lot more deaths, right? And at the end of the day, and I think you maybe even captured it with your earlier comments, it's like, if you're not seeing an obvious deterrent impact, if you're not really reducing high profile crimes and limiting the amount of murders that are out there, not that many people really see it the Kantian way. Nobody really says we have to do this for justice, or at least relatively few do that. And so unless and until there's a lot of new research saying, wow, this really is necessary to keep us safe, I think we've kind of turned the corner. Now, maybe a year from now, you'll have me on to say, now, Berman, you said we weren't going to go back to the death penalty, and here we are.
Oh, I hope wrong. I hope not. I hope not.
And we've heard, but again, we've heard Donald Trump, both while he was president and subsequently start to sort of push this idea of, the death penalty for drug dealers. And that's the way we need to respond to the opiate epidemic. And again, it's not just that he hasn't gotten a lot of traction there, but that it seems as though, for good or for bad, we've turned to other means to kind of have this culture war over crime. And maybe a little bit of it's the defund the police conversation, which is, at the front end of the system, rather than how much of our punishments we're going to focus on. But I also think, and I'll sort of end with this layer of optimism, I don't think the mitigation story has been lost, right? I don't think there's anybody who followed the Cruz case that didn't know how young he was and how troubled he was, right? And that's a testament both to defense attorneys getting that story out well, and our society that has come to texture our understanding of crime much more richly. And here's again where, and maybe this is depressing to a fault, maybe it's only when it's racialized that we kind of lose our mind and don't kind of think this through as carefully as we should. But, I do think that we see, at least with respect to the death penalty, a much more balanced and kind of thoughtful conversation. Though, again, that balance and thoughtfulness often comes with you can't be categorically opposed to the death penalty or else we're not going to vote for you, right? That was the Dukakis story back then. We still saw, obviously, Barack Obama express support for the death penalty, even though he made some trimming. Interestingly, Biden ran a little bit on abolition, but then hasn't really done much to effectuate that, to some people's chagrin. But again, I think at the end of the day, we see that full picture of, okay, it could be the most horrible of horrible crimes, but most people want to at least better understand what's behind that. And even if we think it's the worst of the worst offenses, if it's not also the worst of the worst offender, we're at least open-minded about there could be other options that are appropriate. Again, we still have plenty of people getting the death penalty, but still a heck of a lot less than in its heyday 20 years ago. And I think that's something to, again, kind of compliment everybody on, because I think it's a more thoughtful and nuanced approach to these matters. The ones that, again, I do think you're right to worry maybe less stable than I might want to expect them to be.
All right. Well, that was hopeful enough. I'll take it. My goal, I thought this was going to be the first podcast we were going to be able to get in and out in a half hour, but I should have known to put two lawyers in a virtual room together, that is a virtual impossibility. And that is okay, because this was a great discussion. And I thank you so much for coming back. And for anybody out there who hasn't already subscribed to the Sentencing Law and Policy blog, you really need to do that. And I'm going to put that in my links and show notes, and I am sure we'll be talking again soon. Until then, thank you, Professor Berman. I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you so much for having me on again, Doug. Really appreciate it.
That's it for today, but before we go, I just wanted to take a moment and say thank you. To you, the listener, for spending time with us today getting set for sentencing. Whether you're a lawyer, someone who could use the help, or maybe you're just a true crime buff who loves the inside scoop on how this whole thing works, I am so glad you're here, and I hope you keep listening. If you like the podcast, please do me a favor. Spread the word about Set for Sentencing and give us a rating and review on the iTunes podcast platform. It would really help. Last but not least, if you're interested in knowing more about what I do, mitigation videos, case consults, live teaching, on-demand educational content, books, articles, all of it, please visit www.dougpassonlaw.com. I'm Doug Passon. Until next time, hang in there. Wait a minute, that's a stupid way to sign off a podcast about sentencing. Hang in there. What's the matter with you, man? I guess they call that gallows humor. Sorry. All right. Well, I will see you next time on Set for Sentencing. Bye-bye.